In the vastness of the Karen expanse, there exists a dominion unlike any other. For 3,000 years, the Valorian Imperium has ruled unopposed. Their fleets darken the stars. Their word is absolute law. And their queen, magnificent, eternal, untouchable, has never known fear. Until the day the Karath came. The Valorians are a proud species. Tall, elegant beings of iridescent skin that shifts between violet and deep blue, with crystalline eyes that have witnessed the rise and fall of 100 civilizations. They are warriors by nature, rulers by birthright, and they have never lost a war. But the Karath were different. They came from the obsidian rifts, from the spaces between stars where even light fears to venture. Silent, relentless, consuming. They did not conquer worlds, they erased them. Entire fleets, sent to halt their advance, vanished without a distress signal. Entire populations, proud and ancient, simply ceased to exist. The Karath did not negotiate. They did not pause. They did not stop. And they were coming for the Valorian homeworld. When the Queen's War Council received the final transmission from the Outer Fleet, there was a moment of profound silence. The kind of silence that exists only in the spaces between dying stars. Then, one by one, the council members exchanged glances. Not glances of determination or resolve. Glances of resignation. They were facing extinction. The Valorian Queen, her name was HFY, which in the old tongue meant, she who endures, sat upon the crystalline throne in the Grand Spire, the highest point in the capital city of Valorian Prime. For 3,000 years, her ancestors had occupied this throne. For 3,000 years, no enemy had come close enough to threaten it. Today would be different. How long? She asked, her voice carrying the harmonic resonance that only Valorian royalty possessed. The military commander, General Karath, stood before her. His skin flickered with nervous patterns, reds and oranges bleeding through the usually stable blue. 72 hours, Your Majesty. Perhaps less. The Karath advance is accelerating. We cannot stop them. Those words, we cannot stop them, had never been spoken in the Valorian court before. Queen HFY had lived for 700 years. She had seen civilizations rise to glory and crumble to dust beneath her gaze. But she had never heard her own military commander speak words of surrender. Then we evacuate the planet, the Queen said, her tone absolute. All civilians to the deep space habitats. The court will relocate to the secondary throne world. Preserve what we can preserve. It was the logical choice, the choice of survival, the choice of a leader who understood that a kingdom could rebuild, but only if its people lived. The evacuation began at once. Across the capital city, Valorians rushed toward the great orbital elevators. Families clutched what few possessions they could carry. The old and the young moved together, guided by emergency protocols written centuries ago, protocols that no one had ever truly believed would be needed. The Queen remained in the Grand Spire until the last transport left the surface. She would not flee until her people were safe. This was not just protocol, it was the burden of 3,000 years of rule. A Valorian monarch did not abandon her throne and run into the night like a common refugee. At the base of the spire, guarding the Queen's final exit, stood her personal guard. 12 of the greatest warriors the Valorian Imperium had ever produced. Their armor was wrought from crystal steel, forged in the heart of the planet's core. Their weapons were tuned to their own neural patterns, extensions of their will, impossible for another being to wield. They had trained their entire lives for this moment. They had never imagined they would fail. The Karath arrived not with fanfare, but with silence. The sky simply changed. What had been stars blinked out, one by one, as massive black shapes moved into position above Valorian Prime. The orbital defense grid fired everything it had. Beam weapons, kinetic cannons, fusion warheads. Against the Karath, it was like throwing pebbles at a mountain. The orbital platforms fell silent. Then the ground itself began to shake. Karath landers descended through the atmosphere, impervious to the planet's remaining defense systems. They touched down around the capital, and from their hulls emerged things that had not been designed by any evolutionary process the Valorians understood. They were soldiers, perhaps, or tools, or something in between. Beings of black carapace and writhing appendages, moving with the predatory grace of creatures that had consumed 1,000 worlds. The Valorian Guard met them at the base of the spire. Queen HFY watched from the observation deck as her 12 finest warriors engaged the enemy. They fought with the skill of ages, moving like water, their weapons brilliant and terrible. For perhaps 30 seconds, they held the line. Then the Karath came in overwhelming numbers. The first guard fell, then the second. They were not retreating. They were dying with honor, buying precious seconds for their queen to reach the evacuation transport waiting on the spire's landing platform. "Go!" shouted Commander to Karath, blood streaming from a wound across his crystalline face. "Majesty, go! We will hold them." But they could not hold them. No one could hold them. General Karath was struck down. Then the next guard. And the next. They fought until they could not fight anymore. And when they fell protecting the idea of the Valorian Imperium, the concept of order and civilization in an uncaring universe. It was a noble death. It was also utterly futile. The queen turned to flee. Behind her, the last 3 guards formed a final barrier, knowing full well what would come next. Knowing they would be torn apart. Knowing their deaths would mean nothing against the infinite hunger of the Karath. This was the way of war for the Valorians. Fierce and proud, but ultimately fragile. Beautiful things rarely survive in a universe built on destruction. Queen HFY ran through the corridors of the Grand Spire, her guards' crystalline armor shattering behind her. She could hear the screams, the last defiant cries of warriors who would not accept surrender. She could hear them because she had learned, long ago, to separate her emotions from necessity, to sacrifice the few for the many, to make the cold, hard choices that kept empires alive. This cold, hard choice had cost her 12 of the finest warriors ever to live. This cold, hard choice would save her people. She reached the landing platform. The evacuation shuttle sat waiting, its engines hot, its hatch open. Pilot ready. Destination set. The ship would carry her to the secondary throne world, where the Valorian fleet was gathering, where they would begin the long, bitter work of learning to survive as refugees instead of rulers. It was the logical choice. It was the only choice. She took one step onto the ramp. Then she heard something that made her stop. A voice, a single human voice, shouting through the roar of battle and collapsing architecture. "Queen HFY, hold your position." For a moment, the queen did not understand what she was hearing. Humans. The Valorian Imperium had made first contact with humanity 7 years prior. The humans came from a small, unremarkable planet orbiting an unremarkable sun in a sector of space the Valorians had barely bothered to catalog. They were small, fragile creatures with pale skin and large, expressive eyes. They lived barely 70 years on average, a blink of time compared to a Valorian lifetime. They had only recently developed faster than light travel. The Valorians had found them quaint. When the Karath threat emerged, the Queen had accepted a small contingent of human military advisors. It was a gesture of alliance, nothing more. She had assumed the humans would offer some minor tactical insights, perhaps some clever application of their crude technology. She had never expected them to matter when the final test came. And yet, here was one of them. A human woman emerged through the smoke and fire of the spire's upper levels. Her name was Captain Sarah Chen, and she wore the standard issue suit of Earth's Colonial Defense Force, a sleek white and blue uniform, far less ornate than the Valorian crystal steel, but functional. In her hands, she carried a plasma rifle, and her face bore the determined expression of someone who had just made a choice and accepted whatever consequences would follow. "Captain?" the Queen said, her voice carrying both confusion and something else, something that might have been surprise. "You should be on the evacuation shuttle. Your orders." "My orders were to protect you, ma'am," Sarah said, turning to face the corridor behind them. Already, the first Karath soldiers were emerging through the smoke. "And that's what I intend to do." "It's impossible," the Queen said. "Look at them. You cannot." "No," Sarah said. "Probably not. But I'm not leaving you here alone." There was something in those words, something simple and absolute. The queen, who had ruled for 700 years, who had seen the rise and fall of ages, suddenly found herself watching a human woman. Sarah Chen braced her rifle against the railing of the observation platform and opened fire. The plasma bolts streaked through the corridor, brilliant orange against the black carapace of the Karath. Most of her shots missed or failed to penetrate, but a few found their mark, and the Karath soldiers slowed, just slightly, responding to the presence of this new threat. It bought time. It was not much. In the grand calculus of war, it was infinitesimal. But it was something, an act of defiance in the face of extinction. "Go," Sarah said, not taking her eyes off the enemy. "I'll hold them here. You get to the shuttle. I will not abandon." "That's not a request, Your Majesty." "With respect, ma'am, get on the shuttle." The Queen looked at the human woman, looked at her small, fragile frame, at the determination in her eyes, at the way her hands gripped the rifle with steady certainty despite the impossible odds. And something shifted in the Valorian monarch's understanding of what courage truly meant. She had always thought of courage as endurance, the ability to rule wisely across centuries, the capacity to make hard choices that sacrificed individuals for the greater good, the strength to maintain order and civilization in an uncaring universe. She had never considered that courage might look like a 7-decade lifetime, spent in a body that felt pain and exhaustion and fear, deliberately throwing yourself in front of death for someone else. "Captain," the Queen began. "Your Majesty," Sarah interrupted, the faintest ghost of a smile crossing her face even as she squeezed the trigger again. "You're going to make me shoot a queen. Please don't make me shoot a queen." Despite everything, the flames, the smoke, the sound of dying warriors and collapsing stone, Queen HFY felt something that might have been laughter caught in her throat. She moved toward the shuttle. Behind her, Sarah Chen dug in, pulling out a second magazine from her belt, firing methodically, precisely, with the training of someone who had spent her entire career preparing for a moment when every shot would matter. The Karath soldiers came on, inexorable and hungry, but they were forced to advance through concentrated fire, and they were slowed. Seconds. The captain was buying seconds. The Queen reached the ramp of the shuttle. She paused, turned back one final time, and saw Captain Sarah Chen standing alone against an army of nightmares. "Come back," the Queen called. "Captain, please." Sarah Chen glanced back, and for just a moment, her steady expression faltered. Her ammunition counter was flashing red. Her position was completely exposed. Behind the Karath soldiers, more were coming, an endless tide of black and writhing appendages. She shook her head. "Tell them about this," she said. "Tell them a human stood here. Tell them we didn't run. Tell them we tried." Then she turned back to face the enemy, and she did something that would echo across the galaxy. She smiled. Not the smile of someone in despair or accepting defeat, but the smile of someone who had made a choice, freely and consciously, to do what was right regardless of the cost. The smile of a being who understood that some things mattered more than survival. Some things mattered more than the fear of extinction. She fired her last magazine into the advancing Karath. The Queen stumbled into the shuttle. The pilot didn't hesitate. The hatch sealed. The engines screamed. The vessel lifted away from the grand spire just as the upper levels collapsed in a shower of crystal and flame. Through the viewport, Queen HFY watched as Captain Sarah Chen disappeared beneath the smoke and destruction. Watched as the Karath soldiers poured through the rubble like insects, consuming everything in their path. Watched as the most advanced civilization in the known galaxy fell in the shuttle climbed toward space. But something was wrong. The Queen felt it as a vibration through the floor of the vessel. The pilots were shouting, voices panicked and confused. On the communication channels, reports were coming in from other evacuation vessels, from the fleet, from the few surviving military installations. "The Karath are stopping," someone said, wonderment in their voice. "Their advance. They're stopping." General Karath, his wounds bandaged, his uniform torn, appeared beside the Queen. "Majesty, We're receiving an encrypted transmission from the Karath. They want to negotiate. The Queen stared at him. Negotiate? They do not negotiate. They consume. The message is coming from the Grand Spire, ma'am. From the Central Command Chamber. Your sealed chamber. The one only you should have been able to access. The Queen's crystalline eyes widened. They assembled a viewing screen in the shuttle's command chamber. The feed was degraded, filtered through burning architecture and failing systems, but the image was clear enough. Captain Sarah Chen stood in the center of the Valorian war room, surrounded by Karath soldiers, with her plasma rifle pointed at the single largest Karath creature in the chamber. The one that bore the markings of a queen, a progenitor, an intelligence vastly superior to the simple soldiers that had been sent to consume the world. I don't understand your language, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the impossibility of her situation. And I doubt you understand mine, but I think we can understand this. She placed her hand, her small, fragile human hand, over the quantum reactor that powered the throne room. The reactor that could, if activated in the right way, destroy the entire spire. Destroy the Karath Queen. Destroy herself. The message was unmistakable. In the silence that followed, the Queen of the Valorians understood. This human, this ephemeral being with a lifespan measured in decades, had not just bought time. She had bought salvation. Not through military strength, which the Karath were vastly superior at. Not through cunning, which the ancient Valorians possessed in abundance. But through something else. Something that transcended species and biology. The willingness to sacrifice everything for someone else. Captain Sarah Chen held her position for 11 minutes. 11 minutes while the Karath Queen studied her, learning her, understanding what it meant that this small, fragile creature would choose certain death to protect a sovereign that was not her own. 11 minutes. Then the Karath soldiers began to back away. The Karath Queen, approached Sarah Chen slowly, with what might have been on an alien species whose emotions were impossible to read, something like respect. She looked at the human woman standing before her, hand still on the trigger of annihilation, eyes still steady, still unafraid. The Karath Queen did something no one had ever recorded in any database, any military file, any intelligence report. She turned and retreated. The Karath army, millions strong, mobilized by forces beyond comprehension, simply left. They withdrew from the planet. They retreated from the Valorian space. They returned to the obsidian rifts and did not emerge again. No one knew why. No one would ever know why. Because Captain Sarah Chen did not survive to explain it. As the Karath soldiers withdrew, the reactor she had been holding destabilized. She triggered the evacuation sequence with her last moments, long enough for the shuttle that came to retrieve her to get to the palace. They found her in the throne room, slumped against the reactor console, her vital signs barely registering. She would live, barely, in a medical coma that would last for months. But she would never walk again, never move with the freedom she had once known. The Valorian doctors called it the highest honor they could bestow. They called it not just survival, but transcendence. The rest of the galaxy called it something else. They called it human. When Captain Sarah Chen finally woke, she was in the grand medical complex of Valorian Prime. The planet had been reclaimed. The Karath were gone. The Valorian Imperium, against all odds, had endured. The first face she saw was Queen HFY. The Queen was older somehow, or perhaps it was just the weight of understanding. She knelt beside Sarah's medical pod, a gesture that would have been unthinkable for a Valorian monarch just days ago, and she spoke. The Karath Queen left a message, HFY said, transmitted through channels we did not know they possessed. It was single word, translated to every language in the known universe. It was honor. Sarah tried to speak, but her throat was raw, her body racked with pain. The Queen held up a hand. You do not need to explain. I understand. Or rather, I am beginning to understand. When you came to our world, my people looked upon humanity as minor, young, brief. We looked at your 70-year lifespans and saw weakness. We looked at your small forms and saw fragility. We looked at your simple technology and saw primitiveness. She paused, her crystalline eyes reflecting the light of the medical chamber. What we did not see was your courage. Not the courage of millennium-long empires, not the courage of civilizations tested by centuries of war, but the courage of beings who know they are fragile and small and brief, and choose to stand anyway. The courage of creatures who have so little time and choose to spend it protecting someone else. The courage of a species that has faced extinction before it was truly civilized and refused to accept it. Sarah managed a weak smile. "Just did my job," she whispered. "No," the Queen said, and there was something in her voice that sounded like awe. "You did something far greater than your job. You showed us what we had forgotten, what we had ceased to believe in our long existence. You showed us what it means to be alive." Over the following weeks, as Sarah's body slowly healed, the story spread through the Valorian expanse and beyond, not as a tale of military victory, but as something more profound. A story about the nature of courage itself, about how it was not dependent on age or strength or the power of empires, how it could exist in the brief, burning life of a single human soldier, standing alone in a burning palace. The Valorian military began to change. Human advisors were no longer decorative, they were elevated to command positions. Humanity's greatest strength, the Valorians learned, was not their technology or their military strategy. It was their willingness to care, their capacity for empathy, their ability to transform sacrifice into meaning. Other species throughout the galaxy took note. When the Valorian Imperium signed a mutual defense treaty with the Terran Confederation, it was not because humans had military superiority. It was because the Valorians, and every species that heard Captain Sarah Chen's story, understood something fundamental. Humans did not fight for glory or conquest or the accumulation of power. Humans fought for each other. And in a universe as cold and dark and vast as this one, that might have been the most important discovery anyone had ever made. Sarah Chen returned to duty a year later, though she required assistance to walk. The Valorians, in an unprecedented gesture, had offered to clone a new body for her. A gesture of gratitude that would have been unthinkable before. She refused. The scars, she said, mattered. They meant something. She was assigned as an attaché to the Valorian court, and every day for the next 5 years, she would eat lunch with Queen HFY in the newly reconstructed throne room. They would speak of worlds and strategies and the nature of leadership across species boundaries. And every year on the anniversary of the day the Karath came, the Queen would stand with Sarah overlooking the rebuilt capital city, and she would say the same thing. "I ruled for 700 years before I learned what strength truly meant. A human taught me in a single day, a human who lived barely a third of that time. Tell me, what is it that burns so brightly in your people? That transcendence is so brief, so precious. It consumes with such intensity." Sarah would look out over the city, and she would think of all the humans she had known. All the brief, burning lives that moved through the universe like stars, leaving traces of light and meaning in their wake. And she would smile. "We know how little time we have," she would answer. "So we make it matter." And the Valorian Queen, ancient and wise and eternal, would nod, and for the first time in 700 years, she would understand what it meant to not be immortal. To know that the light was ending, and therefore to burn brighter while you could. In the years that followed, the galaxy expanded. New species joined the alliance. New threats emerged. But none of them would ever forget the day when a human soldier stood alone against an extinction event and refused to run. None of them would ever forget Captain Sarah Chen. But more importantly, none of them would ever forget what her story meant. That courage was not measured in years lived, but in choices made. That honor was not the province of empires, but of individuals. That strength came not from power, but from compassion. And that sometimes the smallest, briefest, most fragile among us can teach the oldest and greatest lessons of all. In the records of the Valorian archives, in the historical database of the Terran Confederation, in 100,000 species libraries across the known universe, the same entry appears. The day the Karath came to Valorian Prime, and why they left. But among humans and Valorians alike, it became known by another name. The day we learned what it means to be human, and for the first time the galaxy understood what it truly meant to stand against the darkness, not with ancient wisdom or superior strength or the accumulated power of civilizations, but with a single heart beating briefly but brilliantly, refusing to surrender, refusing to run, refusing to let the light go out without a fight. The universe is vast and cold and unforgiving. Species rise and fall like waves upon an endless ocean. But in the spaces between the stars, where darkness reigns eternal, there is light. There is always light. And that light comes from the choices we make when no one would blame us for choosing darkness. It comes from beings who stand when they could run, who care when they could abandon, who choose meaning over safety and honor over survival. If the story moved you, if it touched something deep within your own brief, burning light, then subscribe. Subscribe for more stories of humanity among the stars. Stories of the courage, the compassion, the incredible audacity of a species that knows how little time it has, and therefore uses every moment to shine. Because humanity's greatest strength was never our technology. It was never our power. It was always, and will always be, our willingness to be human, even when the entire universe is telling us we should be anything else.